Hey everyone, Sean Frangella here for sjAnimate.com with a new tutorial about how to import, work with, and integrate Cinema 4D models and animations inside of Element 3D version 2 inside of After Effects. So we're kind of like the inception of working with 3D plugins where we're bringing Cinema 4D into a plugin in After Effects, and I don't know if anyone really knows what the hell's going on in that movie. And anyway, in my last tutorial, I went over some of my top new features and diving into Element 3D version 2. So be sure to check that one out if you didn't already. And in this one, I want to really focus on the Cinema 4D integration, bringing in Cinema 4D animations and all the stuff you can do with it, as well as touch on all of the other updates that can help this workflow, such as our reflections and shadows and new updates here and there in version 2. So what we have here is all of these spheres and cubes flying around and animating seemingly randomly that snap into this one little animation of a sphere and a cube. And all of this is being driven by this one little animation in Cinema 4D of just the sphere and this cube moving, and then brought into Element 3D version 2 directly as a Cinema 4D file, where you can really do lots of cool stuff. And you can see the only keyframes I have are actually the animation engine going from all of these instances of it down to one. So we're keeping things really clean and taking advantage of what we can do with importing Cinema 4D animations, textures, and files. So we'll build this as an example of what you can do between Cinema 4D and Element 3D version 2. But there's tons of uses for this, and it really pushes the plugin a lot further if you have even a little understanding and experience with Cinema 4D. So let's get right to it, and we'll start building this. What I'm going to do in After Effects is make a new composition. And then in my new composition, I'll make a new solid with Command or Control Y, and I'll call this E3D, and then I'll drag element onto it. Now, rather than making objects in Element, because the whole point of this tutorial is the Cinema 4D integration, I'm going to go over to Cinema 4D, and I'm in R16, but you could do this with any version of Cinema 4D. This is pretty basic. And if you wanted to use Cinema 4D Lite in After Effects, you could just do File, New, Max on Cinema 4D file, and that would work too because we're not doing anything super crazy. So in Cinema 4D, I'll just make a new file, and then I'm just going to make some basic shapes. So I'll make a cube, and I'll press NB to get wireframes. And we'll do some pretty basic stuff in Cinema 4D. So if you're not too experienced in Cinema 4D, no big deal. We'll keep things simple. And if you do know your way around Cinema 4D, it's good to know that this applies to anything else you might want to do, and you could bring it into Element 3D. So anyway, on my cube, I'm going to click on it and go to Object, and I'll check Fillet to give it rounded edges and pull those down a little. And I'll just move that over here. And then I'm going to make a sphere, and I'll just move that up here. And the point of all this is I want to show how the animations import, as well as bringing in some textures and not having to worry about exporting OBJs or OBJ sequences or really anything, but being able to bring in just the Cinema 4D file, Element 3D version 2, kind of figures everything out, which is nice. So I'm going to go to my cube, and I want to add position and rotation keyframes just to get some interesting animation. And to do that, rather than keyframe each of these, down here in my mini timeline, I'm going to check off parameters and scale. So I'll just keyframe position and rotation, and I'm going to click this key icon to make a keyframe. And you can see it makes a little keyframe down there. And I'm going to go to halfway through this 90 frame animation, and I'm going to move this up and back a little, and then press R to rotate, and I'll just rotate it around so it's in a different position. And in Cinema 4D, it works a little differently. It's important to note that doesn't make a keyframe, and I need to remember to click this. You also could enable auto keying. It would work familiar to After Effects. And now I have an animation of this going from the bottom to the top and rotating. And then I can just click and drag and select this keyframe, right click, copy it, go to the end of this little timeline and paste. And then it'll snap it back into the original position. And if I play this, you can see that we have this really basic little animation of this cube moving and going. One difference you'll note if you're more familiar with After Effects is that Cinema 4D automatically adds in easing to our keyframes, which you can see here on the timeline. So it's just something to note. If you wanted to change that, you could select the keyframes and change it to linear, and then it would be back to non-easing keyframes, but we'll just leave it at this. So anyway, we're going to do the same sort of thing with this sphere. So I'll grab our sphere, and same thing, I'll click to make a keyframe, go to frame 45, and then I'm going to move this, snap it over here, rotate it, just to illustrate what we're doing with animation. make a new keyframe, and then same thing, copy this first one, go to the end and paste. And then we get this little animation where they're kind of switching places and moving, and they end up back at the same point, so it could be looping. Now I'll save this file, C4D test 05, and that's all we're gonna need to import into Element 3D. But before we do that, I'm gonna make some basic textures, which we can do down here by clicking on this box, and I'll click this and call it sphere, and this will be a texture for our sphere. And I won't get too far into texturing in Cinema 4D. I just wanna make a point that it will transfer over some of the basic stuff. So I'll go to color, and I'll make this kind of a light gray, and I'll go to OK. And we could do a lot more, but we can kind of bring this in as it is and then add the textures. And we can just bring this in and then tweak the textures later. I just want to make the point that they'll come in with some of these basic settings. So I'll drag that onto my sphere, and then I'll just duplicate that by holding Command and dragging to the right. And then I can double click this, rename it cube, and that's just the name of my texture. And I'll make this like a bright green, go to OK, drag that onto my cube, and then I have this little looping animation with these swapping around, and there's some basic textures on it. And I'll just go ahead and save that file. And that's all we're gonna do in Cinema 4D. And then I'm gonna go back into After Effects, and I'll go to Scene Setup, and then I can import, and I'll grab that Cinema 4D file and go to Import. And one little thing I'll say I did intentionally is if I go to OK, nothing's gonna come in, so I'll just undo that. Because in Cinema 4D, if you're using primitives, it's really important to note that you need to make these editable for them to show up, because right now this is being seen as a sphere and a cube that can still have adjustments to these basic primitive settings. Element 3D needs to see them as just the geometry, so we need to make each of these editable, or press C on each of them, and you can see that it changes the icon and makes them just the geometry. And I'll save this, and now in Element 3D, if we import, it'll work. So if you ever get tripped up bringing in Cinema 4D files on primitives, be sure to make them editable, and then I'll go to Import, and now I get this new dialog box of how I want to load the material, the animation, and some extra settings such as the alignment. The couple things that are important is that we need to import load animation, which is already defaulted, and if we want to go with standard or a physical shader. So I'll just do a physical shader and go to OK. And if I zoom out here, there we have our animation, and it's brought in both of our materials that we can further adjust here. So let's make these a little more reflective in Element 3D. So I'll just scroll down on the sphere texture and turn up the reflective intensity, and then turn down glossiness just a little so it's a little bit of a blurry reflection. And then I'll grab my cube and do the same thing. Now we could do a lot more with textures, but again, I'm just trying to illustrate the point of how all this works and what you can send over. Now, I did do some tests in Cinema 4D of trying to send over more parts like procedural bump maps. However, as far as I understand, in Element 3D, most of the texturing, such as those bump maps, are all done with image maps, and there's not really procedural texturing for that sort of thing unless I'm missing something. But it does bring over the color and reflectivity and some of those settings. So anyway, we got our two objects. Now if I go to OK, I have my scene, and I'll make a new camera so I can back out and see this animation. And now if I press 0 to play this, we have our little looping animation that we made in Cinema 4D working inside of Element 3D. And this is good, this is really useful, but we can take this a lot further. This is just one instance of this animation on this particle replicator, and that's one of the big uses of Element 3D is this particle replicator system, as well as bringing in this baked animation. So right now it's just infinitely looping that, and how it's handling that animation, if we go to particle look, there's baked animation, and this is where we can control how it's dealing with that animation that we brought in from Cinema 4D. So now it's at loop. We could freeze it at end, and then it would just play once and then stop, as well as remap the time if we wanted to play it faster or slower. But when these settings get to be useful is when we have multiple instances of this, and we can really randomize all these. So let's go to particle replicator. Instead of one of these little animations, we can have a whole array of them. So if I go to 3D grid, now we have a whole array of these, and we can scale this shape up. And let's do something like 6 by 6 by 6. And now it's all that same animation starting at the same time with the same shapes, just in a grid. So it looks way too uniform. But we just scale this shape up a bit and take our particle down quite a bit. Again, right now it just looks like there's one grid, and it's not very interesting. But what we can do is randomize the distribution of these as well as how that animation loops and plays. So right now there's 6 by 6 by 6 of that animation, all starting and ending at the same time and looping. If we change this from loop to random loop, it's going to loop each of these, but start and play them at a random frame. So now if we play through this a bit, you can see it's a little more interesting. It's starting them all at a random frame and they're all going to loop, but not at the same time. And we can randomize the distribution of these even more. If we go in our particle look to particle rotation and let's randomize the rotation, it's going to randomize each set of animations. And then we can just scale this up a bit. And now it's starting to look a lot more interesting and random and not like it's all the same little thing. And since there's 2 objects in each of these little animations, we could even randomize each of those separately under our particle look. If we go to multi-object, we can enable that. And now we could even randomize each object within the animation. So we could randomize the rotation of each particle as well as scatter, displace, and really push these around a lot. And since we're just looking at the animation, we can come down here and we'll put this on preview and just play this through a bit. And now you can see it's starting to look a lot more interesting. They're kind of all floating around and not just doing the same thing. And we can keep going under particle look. Since we changed the size, we could randomize the size a bit more. So they're not all the same size, and then just bring the original size back up. So now we have kind of more interesting different scales to them. And what's cool about this is that it's loading into this array, that one little animation, but we can even make more copies of that same thing now in Element 3D to get different shapes and colors all within the same group array. So if we go back to scene setup, what I could do is make multiple instances of this same little Cinema 4D animation and swap out the textures. So in the same group 1 folder, if I duplicate all, it's going to duplicate my model and my textures. And then I can just change these textures a bit. So on my sphere, I'll make this kind of a dark grayish black color. And on my cube, I'll make this bright orange. And then if I go to OK, it's going to randomly distribute copies of those. And we could keep going. Let's make this orange one not as reflective. And let's make a couple other copies. So I'll duplicate all again. And I'll change this cube to a dark color. And I'll change the sphere to and a bright pink and take down the reflectivity on that. And then let's make a couple more copies. So I'll duplicate all again, change this sphere to red and the cube to like blue. And let's do one more copy, duplicate all again. You can see it's duplicating all of the textures as well. So they're separate. And then let's make this sphere kind of a goldish orange color and the cube something different. I don't know, maybe purple, and then OK. And now if I go to OK, it's going to randomly distribute those. And you can see we're getting all sorts of different colors and things. And I'll just scale this whole particle shape up a bit more. And let's randomize the rotation a bit more. And if we ever don't like how these are kind of looking overlapping, we can always go to here under particle look and change the random seed. And it's going to really reorganize those. And these kind of look a little small and overlapping. So what we can do is just bring that particle size back up a bit. And then I'll just push the random rotation under multi-object a little more. And now they're a little more broken up and a little more interesting. There we go. And now that we kind of have this sea of these particles, what we can do is really start to mess with how they look, how the reflections are happening, and how we're getting lighting and shadows. So for render mode, I'll go to full render. And right now they're all just kind of floating and they don't look like the light is interacting with each other. There's not really any shadows or anything. And that's not interesting. So I'll go back into scene setup. And one thing we can do with our environments now, if I check on environment, is get into backlight environments where there's a lot more options for HDRI reflections. And we can try out different scenes to control our reflections and lighting through all of these new options. And let's go with this one. This looks pretty interesting, this 44. And I'll go to OK. And that looks pretty crazy, but let's go with it. And now what we can do is start to really adjust how our light is happening. So right now, again, they're all just really flat. But if I add a new light, I'll make this a parallel light and make it kind of a light blue. And then I'm going to make sure cast shadows is on. And I can pull this kind of over to one side a bit and then pull the point of interest this way. So it's kind of pointing this way. Now we get a little more dramatic lighting. And then on the Element 3D layer, I'm going to go down here and go to render settings, and I can adjust the ambient occlusion, and I'll turn that on and check that on as ray trace. So we're getting more realistic ambient occlusion. And then I can go to our shadows and I'll enable those. And if I turn on ray traced, now we're going to start to get the shadows actually interacting with each other and hitting. And it looks a little overwhelming with this lighting. So what's nice is we could always go back into our scene setup and maybe change this to something that's not as extreme so we could see what we're doing. So let's try this one and go to OK. And that's a little more reasonable. We're still seeing lots of copies of these, but that's fine. And now being able to add shadows in really helps. You can see right now with them off, we're getting lighting, but they're not really falling on each other, and it looks like they're all just flat. And we check that on, and we're getting the actual shadows of the objects hitting. And now we can light this a little more. I'll make another light, and this time I'll go with a spotlight, a kind of an orange color, and I'll put this over on our left side, and that'll kind of balance our light out. And then I can just pull this point of interest or go down here to point of interest and make sure I'm directing it at these objects, and maybe turn that light up a bit. And I could always look at different views too. Right now I'm looking at my camera, but I could look at my top view and zoom out a bit and just make sure that these lights are actually hitting those objects. And we can always turn our lights on and off to see what they're doing. So we're seeing this one on the side kind of hit some of these back spheres, and maybe we'll put the position a little more towards the camera so we're hitting more of these. And there we go. We can really see how the second light is kind of hitting these. This is to illustrate what we can do now with our lights, shadows, and reflections that we couldn't do before. And again, this is all being driven by this one little animation from Cinema 4D. And now if we want to keep setting up our shot, we can start to add things like depth of field and motion blur and really hone in how we want our focus to fall. Because right now, it's all really in focus, and that's not really how cameras would work. So on our camera, we can go to our camera settings by pressing AA, and I'll turn on our depth of field, and then we'll start to see our depth of field. And we can see that they're all kind of out of focus, so that's no good. And if we turn up our aperture a bit to like 50, that's going to tighten our plane of focus and makes objects that are not in focus more out of focus. But we can see that nothing is in focus, and that's a problem. So one little trick we can do to really control what's in focus in Element 3D is if we scroll down, go to Output, we can change it from Show Composite to Focus. And it's not going to look like it's showing anything. It's just going to be all black because actually nothing is in focus right now. So if we pull this focus distance to the right really far, we'll start to see objects come into focus. And now what it's doing is showing the in-focus objects in white and out of focus in black. So we can really hone in and control where our plane of focus falls. And now if we go back down in our Element 3D layer to show composite, we'll see that those white areas are in focus. And then we could really pull the aperture more if we wanted to get an even tighter plane of focus. And the further away objects will really be out of focus. So it's a good little trick to really control that. And now that we have all of our shapes, there's a lot of other stuff we could keep doing. We can add adjustment layers to really push and color correct this a bit more. So on an adjustment layer, we could go to curves and really pull this contrast. And this is the idea of doing color correction in post-production. Even though this is just an After Effects plugin, it's still good to do this. So we could maybe pull this and really adjust how we're pushing these colors. And then on this whole animation, if we wanted these to kind of animate around, float around, and then snap back to just one of those little animations playing like we did here in our example where they're all floating and they kind of animate to one. We can go back to scene setup, and then I'll put just one instance of these on group 2. So I'm going to make a copy of this whole bottom one. I'll duplicate just the model because I don't need to change the textures, and I'll drag and pull it out of group 1, and I'll click here and put it in group 2. And that's going to make one instance of that somewhere, and that's fine. What we can do is now go to our animation engine and enable that, and it's going to animate group 1 into group 2 based on this animation percentage of 0 to 100. So at 2 seconds, if we check that on, and then I'll go ahead 1 second and then put it at 100, it'll then animate those over that 1 second from these 2 keyframes, kind of pulling themselves into that second group, which can be a really cool little animation, get some really interesting stuff. And the only other thing we need to do if we were really mimicking that whole animation is now we can see that that's out of focus, and that's a problem. So we could even animate our camera focus distance right here to align to those keyframes. So At 2 seconds, we know we have it where we want it. I'll turn on that focus distance. And then at 3 seconds, do that same thing. Go to our output on our element 3D layer, go to focus, and pull this until we start to see those objects get in focus and light up. And there it is. We can see that the sphere is in focus, and that's good. And it'll animate those. And we could add eases in and out if we want to really smoothly change that focus. And then on our element 3D layer, change that back to composite. And then if we press 0 to render and play this, and then we get these all floating around and they snap back into this one little instance of this Cinema 4D animation. And we're getting all of our lighting and shadows and our reflections being caused by our HDRI map. And it's all being driven again by that one little Cinema 4D animation. So if we adjusted this and just reloaded the file, it would update that whole thing. And then for final rendering, if we wanted to really push this, you can see our edges are a little jagged. We could always push the multi-sampling up a bit, as well as super sampling, and then check on motion blur for our comp, as well as our element 3D layer. And then we get our nice clean edges we can see, as well as our motion blur, and get to something like this example that I showed you. So this one is a really basic little animation of just these little cubes and spheres rolling around and snapping, but it definitely illustrates the potential and power of integrating Cinema 4D into Element 3D. And this can apply to any animations and files from Cinema 4D that it could come up with, and really helps to simplify the process of being able to just save the Cinema 4D file and bring it in directly into Element 3D and do all sorts of stuff like replicate the instance of the animation, check on multi-object, adjust the baked animation, and really do a lot of stuff that Element 3D does well, and combine Cinema 4D and Element 3D to do all sorts of interesting and weird stuff like this in this case. So this was a really fun one to put together. It's kind of combining all of my favorite toys, so I was excited to do this. And there's a lot of new features of Element 3D, so again, be sure to check out my other video if you already didn't, and I'll have some other new ones going over some new features and different workflows like compositing, live action footage, as well as some deformers and logo bending and all sorts of new stuff. So check those out, and check out that last one I already have up. And if you have any requests for tutorials or questions about Element 3D or Cinema 4D or anything compositing and After Effects related, be sure to also follow me on Twitter.com/Sean Frangella, as well as check out the Facebook.com at Facebook.com/Vital, and subscribe on YouTube.com/Sean Frangella. And as always, thanks for watching. I hope you learned a lot about integrating Cinema 4D with Element 3D and get the idea of all this cool new stuff you can do by combining the two apps. And I will see you at the next video.